Mentioned at the beginning of the Mass, we celebrate the feast of St. Bridget today. And St. Bridget was born into a royal family in Sweden in the 1300s. And she had one of those arranged marriages with the Prince of Sweden. So she became a princess, went on to have 8 children. As they got older and the children were raised, she said to her husband, I would like to join a religious order. And he and she split up by mutual agreement. He became a Cistercian and joined their religious order, and she founded her own convent. So she was not only a nun, she was a mother, and she was a wife. This reading, the gospel, is pretty appropriate because Jesus is being asked by his apostles, why do you keep telling us parables, telling us stories? And Jesus said, it's because that those who are meant to hear and understand, and who try to look into the depths of the mysteries of the stories, those ones will be enriched by those stories. But the ones who just kind of hear and don't really care, what little bit they understand is going to get snatched away. Just like the parable that we read the other day about the seed that's sown on the ground, of its roots aren't very long. When the sun comes, they're destroyed. But if those roots are deep, then the plant grows and bears great fruit. Jesus told things in parables because the people that he was talking to were a tradition, an oral tradition, where all of their family stories weren't necessarily written down. It's not like they did autobiographies. Most of it was handed down from generation to generation on the laps of grandparents who would bring the little ones up to them and tell them the stories. And they would hand those stories on to their children, who would hand them on to their children. I'm sure St. Bridget did the same thing with her children, telling them stories. And if you think about the stories that we heard when we were little, maybe you heard the Aesop's fables, or the story of the tortoise and the hare, or the story of the king's new clothing. All of the little parables that we learned, there's lessons to them, and it's easy to remember the story, but you have to dig a little deeper to get the meaning of the story. Most of you have probably seen the Karate Kid movies where this little boy, teenager, is being beaten up by bullies, and he goes to this old man who agrees to teach him karate. But when he comes to learn karate, he says, here, before we start, I want you to wax my car. Put the wax on with this hand and take the wax off by going in semicircles the other way. So he did it, and then he said, okay, wash this and paint this fence and do all these things. And he got frustrated finally, and he said, why are you making me wax your car? And he said, you were learning all the time. He said, no, I wasn't. I was learning to wax. And he said, okay, wax on. And he threw a punch at him, and he went like that, and he blocked the punch. Wax off, and he threw another punch, and he blocked it the other way. He said, see, you were learning all the while. Even though you didn't know, you had to learn to trust. And the lesson wasn't about karate, it was about life. And those little stories that get passed on from generation to generation from the Bible, whether it's the story of Noah and the ark, or Moses and the 10 Commandments, or Samson and Delilah, all of those stories have a reason. And if we, as adults, look into those stories and ponder them, and those moments that we have when we're waiting in the grocery line or waiting at a red light and being impatient because there's construction, if we ponder those stories and mine them for the depths of the meaning, it'll enrich our lives. And if we teach the children those stories and then teach them to think about the stories, just like it says in the first reading, Jesus is talking through the prophet, or God is talking through the prophet Jeremiah, and he says, I loved you. I brought you into this beautiful land of Israel. There were crops there that you didn't even plant. And how did you treat me? First of all, you forgot all about me. Oh, I don't want to think about God. I'm not going to pray. I'm not going to pay attention to him. let alone offer sacrifices. As if that wasn't bad enough, you started worshiping false gods. You're worshiping this god Baal. You're like cisterns that are broken and have no water in them. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're praying to gods that don't exist, so it's like dumping water into a broken well. The water just seeps out and you have nothing. The Bible is full of those analogies and those stories that are rich in our faith and rich in stories of how we're supposed to guide and lead our lives. It's so important that we teach those stories to future generations, but even more importantly, to teach them to ponder those stories so that we can mine them for all the depths of the meaning that God had in them when he told the stories in the first place. Our question for today is, are we going to remember those stories? Are we going to ponder those stories? Are we going to learn the wisdom from them? And more than anything else, are we going to apply those stories and that wisdom that we learn in our lives to make our lives and the lives of the next generation better than they are today?